Barbara Melchert, and I'm from the Department of Molecular Pharmacology of the University of Groningen. Today's date is March 20th, and this is a recorded class for the course Pathology and Immunology for the first year pharmacy students. I originally gave this class on March 3rd, but I re-recorded it for a complete set of online lectures. So this particular class will be on the history of immunology. Because immunology is a relatively new field. It started because humans wanted to fight infectious diseases. So from around the 1600s to the 1900s, immunology was defined by experience immunology. People didn't understand why diseases developed, didn't know about cells, but they had experience and they knew what worked and what didn't. Then from the beginning of the 20th century to the middle of the 20th century, there was experimental immunology, in which cells were discovered, antibodies, and people were starting to piece together how the immune system works. Now we're in the era of modern immunology, which actually has managed to elucidate a lot about how the immune system works. Of course, we haven't figured it out completely, but we know a lot more about the immune system. So the reason for wanting to understand immunology, I guess, was because infectious diseases have always been around and are taking a lot of lives. So now in these times of Corona, people are really, again, very aware of it. But in the 19th century, a lot of people were dying because of epidemics. And this graph here shows you the chances of surviving as a child before the age of 5, which was dramatically low in the 19th century. Around 50% of the children died before the age of 5. And with better living conditions, better hygiene, and the development of vaccinations, we managed to bring child mortality down a lot. So in the 19th century, a lot of children died. Many families were constantly had a lot of children dying, and this was also the era that photography developed. And people started to make pictures of their dead children to have something to remember them by. So here's a tombstone of a family that had at least 4 children. And as you can see, they all died in the year of 1874. So that probably means that they died during a particular epidemic. So what people did with the development of photography is that they made pictures of their children with their favorite toys or with other family members. So here's a little girl that died that has been depicted with her dolls. Here is a girl that died and is photographed with her mother. Here's a whole family of which the last little girl died but has been photographed with her siblings. So there was a lot of grief going around, and this is a picture that was very common. Worried parents sitting by the beds of their children, hoping they would survive either a cholera epidemic or a smallpox epidemic, as this little girl is showing. So here's a graph showing the mortality from the 1800s to the from the 1900s to the 20th century, and what you can see here is that there were spikes in mortality, and these coincide with epidemics. So here was a typhus epidemic that killed a lot of people, smallpox, cholera, the occasional war as well. And here these epidemics and mortality numbers are divided up in diseases. As you can see here, the red one was a big killer, and that was scarlet fever. But also the orange one here, whooping cough, killed a lot of people, and they all come in spikes, right, when there was a particular epidemic going on. And you can also see that this decreased, and that was because of better hygiene, better living conditions, and eventually the development of vaccines that really pushed those infectious diseases down. I guess because these infectious diseases are not very common anymore because of vaccinations, people don't really know about them anymore, haven't seen them, and don't realize how dangerous they can be. So I thought I'd introduce a couple of them to you. For instance, scarlet fever, the big killer in the 19th century. It is, these are some pictures of scarlet fever. It is caused by a streptococcus, and what you get is these very specific red rash on your body and on your cheeks, and particularly on your tongue as well. And this rash is called by a pyrogenic exotoxin, which is secreted by the bacterium. There is no vaccine against this disease, but nowadays we can treat it with antibiotics. And why did it kill so many people? Well, because people didn't have had very bad hygiene, bad living conditions, so not a lot of resistance against infectious diseases. And when your general condition isn't good, you easily get complications when the bacterium spreads in your body. It can also induce an autoimmune response, which is very specific of this bug, and then we call it rheumatic fever, and that involves the heart, because the heart has proteins that resemble some of the proteins of the bacterium, and then your immune system is trying to fight the bacterium but recognizes these proteins in the heart as bacteria-like and start attacking the heart, and then you get something which is called carditis, or inflammation of the heart. Another one that killed many people, diphtheria, which is caused by a Corynebacterium. And what is very specific for this disease is a very sore throat with a gray pseudomembrane covering the tonsils. It is fatal in 5 to 10% of the cases, and especially in the younger children and people over 40. And what kills the cells is the toxin which is produced by the diphtheria bacterium. How does that kill cells? So here we have the toxin, which can be taken up into cells through endocytosis. Here's an endocytotic vesicle called an endosome, and this endosome will be acidified to degrade whatever is taken up, and when it's acidified, the unit A from the diphtheria toxin is released from the endosome and can inhibit protein synthesis. So when a cell cannot make proteins anymore, it will die. So the gray pseudomembrane that is can be found in the throat is lots of dying cells. Another one, cholera, which is caused by vibrio cholera. It causes diarrhea and vomiting because, again, this bacterium makes a toxin which stimulates the efflux of water and ions into the intestinal lumen, and that causes diarrhea. It's also called the Blue Death because people who caught this disease became dehydrated and therefore had a bluish gray skin. Then one that is still around a lot these days because of the anti-vax movement, measles, which is called by a virus, the morbillivirus. It causes a fever with these very specific red dots, and it's highly contagious. It's one of the most contagious diseases we know, and it has a mortality varying from 0.2% to 10% depending on the general condition of the person who gets it. And usually people who die have complications like pneumonia and diarrhea. So another one that killed a lot of people before, but that we can now vaccinate against, is the whooping cough, or pertussis, which is caused by a bacterium, Bordetella pertussis. The disease is also known as the 100-day cough. People who have this disease have a serious cough that lasts for a very long time. It has a relatively high mortality of 0.5%. And the coughing by people who have the disease is very specific. And I have a little movie here of a boy who has pertussis. So the coughing by these children, in this case by this boy, is so bad that it's difficult to breathe. It induces vomiting, and sometimes people also cough up blood because they're coughing so badly. Then the last one is smallpox. It's also a virus called variola, and the typical symptoms are fever, vomiting, and these very specific sores that develop and leave people scarred for life. Luckily, we have a vaccine for this disease. And actually, it's the first disease that people started to vaccinate against, and that is part of experience immunology, because people already started this practice a very long time ago in China, before the year 0. And how did that work? Well, people noticed that they didn't know this yet, but they noticed that there were 2 variants of the disease, and we now know it's because there are 2 types of viruses. There's variola minor and variola major. The minor variant has a mortality of 1 to 2%, and the major variant has a mortality of 30%. So what people noticed is that some people would get the disease but survive, and that these people were then protected against disease forever. So what they started to do is, when they noticed that there was this disease spreading that didn't have a very high mortality, they would use scabs of the pox and blow them into the nose of people who didn't have the disease yet, to give them the disease so that they would develop the less lethal disease. So this practice was invented in China and eventually spread to Turkey. And in Turkey, this was picked up by Lady Montagu, who was a diplomat's wife, and she brought it to Europe. She herself had experience with variola. She had the disease herself and was disfigured by it and lost a brother to it. So when she learned of this practice, she wanted to try this for her own children, because she didn't want to lose her own children. So she brought it back to England, where it was first tested on abandoned children and prisoners, something which of course nowadays is frowned upon. And people had the wildest ideas of why this worked, and they called it variolation, named after the virus variola. And what did they think? How did they think this worked? So here are 4 theories that were going around, and one of the theories is that your blood has moisture, excess moisture, that the virus or the disease needs to grow. And if you had the disease, then this excess moisture was driven from the blood through the pox. So because these pox were filled with fluids, right? So this fluid was taken from the blood, so that meant that it wasn't available anymore for the disease when you were exposed to disease again. Another theory is that everybody had contaminants of menstrual blood in their blood, because everybody's born from a mother, and the mother would give the child contaminants of menstrual blood. And the idea was that diseases could develop from these contaminants. But once the disease had developed, these contaminants were not present anymore, so you couldn't get the disease twice. Another theory was that the pox distend the pores of the skin, and once these pores have been distended, then you cannot get the disease again. And then the last theory was that everybody's born with all seeds of disease. But once you've used up one of those seeds, it cannot come back. Of course, these theories now seem very funny and wild, but of course, with the info they had at the time, these seemed like very valid theories. And think about it, about all the theories that we have now about how diseases work, and that will be laughed at by people in the future. In 400 years, they will probably think, what the heck were they thinking at the time? Just like we are thinking now about these theories. So Lady Montagu took the practice of variolation to the UK, and that coincided with a farmer called Benjamin Jesty that started a separate practice of inoculation against smallpox, because this farmer had cows, and he knew that cows could also get a form of smallpox. And what he noticed was that the milkmaids would get these pox as well, but it would only give them a few pox on their arms, and they wouldn't get very ill. But the milkmaids who had gotten these pox on their arms, they were protected from the human version of the disease. So what he started to do was inoculate himself and his children with this cowpox to protect themselves. And he told this to Edward Jenner, who was a scientist, and Edward Jenner wrote a paper about this, and that's when the practice started to spread. So what they were actually doing here was, the cow also has a smallpox virus, which is specifically adapted to cows and can grow very well in cows, but it cannot grow very well in humans. And that's the way we vaccinate these days as well, by vaccinating with a bug that is not adapted to humans very well, cannot spread in humans very well, but it can get an immune response going and make immune cells and antibodies against the disease that can protect you. Now, actually, the word vaccination is derived from this practice, because vaccinia is the Latin word for cow, or vaxus, and that's how vaccinations developed. And that was so successful that smallpox is now actually eradicated. It's not present anymore in the world, and it's one of the greatest successes of the immunological sciences. Of course, you must know about the big debate that's going on these days about vaccinations. To vaccinate or not, that is the question. There's a big movement of anti-vaxxers that argue that vaccinations are dangerous and causing disease, particularly autism. But this has been debunked because the paper that showed that there was a link with autism was a complete fictional paper. The data didn't support the story, and the paper has been retracted, and the guy Andrew Wakefield, who published this, has been struck off from the medical register. But still, it started up a discussion, and since people are not experiencing all these infectious diseases anymore, they don't know how bad they were, people start to wonder if vaccinations are any good. Well, just to hope and convince you, hope I can convince you a little bit. So this is what anti-vaxxers usually use as an argument, is why we don't need vaccinations actually. This is measles and the people dying from measles, and you can see that before we started vaccinations, we already had a big decrease in the number of deaths from measles because of better living conditions, better hygiene. So by the time vaccinations started, there weren't actually a lot of people dying anymore from the disease. But if you look at the number of people who actually got the disease, you can see that that didn't change a lot by better hygiene and better living conditions. Still, the same number of people were developing the disease, and when vaccination started, there was a huge drop in the number of people who got the disease. And here you can still see that there was a proportion of the people dying from measles that really went down to almost zero by vaccinations. And by vaccinating, we also protect the people who cannot be vaccinated. We call that herd immunity. We protect the people who, for some reason, are not responding to a vaccination or cannot be vaccinated because their immune system is compromised. And if the disease cannot spread, they also cannot get infected. So in the next couple of online classes, we'll talk more about how the immune system fights infections. And basically the immune system has two parts that need to collaborate to get the best possible immune system. And that is the innate immune system, that's the immunity you are born with, and adaptive immunity, that's the immunity that you have to develop.